Stop for a moment and consider this carefully. Your mind is not waiting for instructions. It is already receiving them. Every hour, every conversation, every image, every environment you step into is shaping you quietly, consistently, and without asking for your permission. There is no neutral state. You are either being programmed or you are programming yourself. Most men believe their thoughts are their own, that their opinions are original, that their decisions are the result of independent thinking. But look closer. Where did those thoughts begin? And why do they repeat so easily? That is the question most avoid because the answer is uncomfortable. You are influenced more than you realize ways, but in subtle, repeated exposures that shape your perception over time. And unless you recognize this, you will live out patterns that were consciously chosen. Let me ask you something directly. Why do you think the way you do about success and your own potential? Did you deliberately choose those beliefs, or did they form naturally through repetition, environment, and exposure? Repetition is the mechanism. What you hear often becomes familiar. What becomes familiar begins to feel true, and what feels true starts to guide your decisions automatically, without effort, without resistance, without question. That is how programming works. Not through force, through consistency. You do not wake up one day and decide to think small. You absorb limitations slowly through daily exposure, through conversations, media, surroundings, and subtle reinforcement that conditions your expectations until limitation feels normal. And once something feels normal, it becomes invisible. This is how potential is reduced. Not by lack of ability, but by unseen influence shaping your belief about what is possible. And once belief is limited, action follows because you will never act beyond what you believe is attainable. Action always follows belief. If you believe success is difficult, you will approach it with hesitation. If you believe opportunity is rare, you will not pursue it aggressively. If you believe you are not ready, you will delay. And all of it will feel logical because it has been repeated. Have you ever noticed how certain thoughts return without effort? Doubt, comparison, delay, the quiet voice that questions your ability just as you are about to act. That is not random. It is programming repeating itself, and repetition strengthens it. Each time you entertain the same thought, you reinforce it. Each time you accept it without challenge, you make it more familiar. And over time, it becomes an automatic part of your identity. This is where control is lost, not in one moment, but gradually. You begin to react instead of direct, to follow instead of choose, to think in patterns that were installed over time without ever questioning their origin. But familiarity is not truth. It is repetition. And repetition can be changed, but only if it is seen, because what remains unseen continues to operate without resistance. It shapes your decisions quietly, guiding your actions while you believe you are in control. This is why awareness is power. The moment you recognize what is influencing you, you regain the ability to choose, to accept or reject, to replace or reinforce, and that choice determines the direction of your life, because the mind does not filter for you. It accepts what is repeated. So if you do not choose what enters your mind, something else will choose for you. And that something will not always lead you toward growth, clarity, or success. It will lead you toward familiarity, and familiarity often leads you back to where you started. In this lesson, you will uncover 7 specific forces that are shaping your thinking right now. Not obvious forces, but subtle ones. The kind that operate quietly, influencing your perception without demanding attention. You will begin to notice patterns. You will recognize thoughts that do not belong to you. And once you see them, you will have the power to change them. But understand this clearly. This is not about avoiding influence. That is impossible. This is about controlling it, because your mind is always open, always absorbing, always building, always forming beliefs based on what it receives repeatedly. And what it builds will eventually shape your results. So, the programmed, you are. The question is, by what? And once you answer that, something shifts. You stop reacting, you begin choosing. And the moment you begin choosing what enters your mind, you begin to shape what comes out of your life. There is a condition which governs the life of nearly every man, yet remains largely unnoticed. It is not a force that announces itself with authority, nor does it compel obedience through command. It operates quietly, persistently, and without resistance. It is the acceptance of thought without question. If I were to begin again, I would first seek to understand this condition, for it is here that control is either lost or gained. Most men believe their thoughts are their own. They assume that what they think they have chosen, that their opinions are formed through reason, that their conclusions are the result of deliberate consideration. Yet, if they were to examine closely, they would discover that many of their most frequent thoughts did not originate within them at all. They were received, repeated, accepted, and in time, believed. The mind does not distinguish in its early reception between what is true and what is merely familiar. It accepts what is presented often. It distinguish in its early reception between what is true and what is merely familiar. It accepts what is presented often. It adopts what is heard repeatedly. It gives weight not to accuracy, but to frequency. This is the beginning of influence. A man hears an idea once, and it passes. He hears it again, and it becomes noticeable. He hears it often, and it begins to feel correct, not because it has been proven, but because it has been repeated. Familiarity, when unexamined, takes the place of truth, and this substitution is rarely detected. For the man does not feel that he has accepted something from without. He feels that he has arrived at a conclusion from within. The thought appears natural. It carries no sign of its origin. It presents itself as his own. Thus he does not question it. And what is not questioned is accepted. What is accepted is repeated, and what is repeated becomes belief. This process is gradual. Accepted. What is accepted is repeated, and what is repeated becomes belief. This process is gradual. It does not occur in a single moment. It unfolds over time through small exposures, through ordinary conversation, through observation of others, through the constant flow of impressions that pass through the mind each day. No single instance appears significant, yet together they form structure. If I were to begin again, I would recognize that my mind is not empty, waiting to be filled by deliberate thought. It is already active, already receiving, already forming patterns based on what it encounters. There is no neutral state. The mind is always being influenced. The question is not whether influence is present. It is whether it is recognized. Most men never arrive at this recognition. They proceed through life under the assumption that their thinking is independent. They do not pause to examine why certain ideas return to them with ease, why certain doubts arise at particular moments, why certain limitations feel reasonable. They accept these thoughts because they are familiar, and familiarity feels safe. Yet safety is not truth. It is repetition. There are thoughts which appear at the moment of decision, thoughts that suggest delay, thoughts that question ability, thoughts that diminish expectation. These thoughts are not random. They are the result of prior influence. They have been installed gradually through repeated exposure until they operate without effort. And because they require no effort, they are rarely challenged. If I were to begin again, I would not accept a thought simply because it appears easily. I would not assume that what comes to mind belongs there. I would question its origin. Accept a thought simply because it appears easily. I would not assume that what comes to mind belongs there. I would question its origin. I would examine its effect. I would determine whether it serves my direction or opposes it. For the mind, when left unguarded, does not filter for purpose. It accepts for familiarity. This distinction is critical, for a man may be guided by thoughts that do not serve him, yet he follows them willingly, believing them to be his own. He delays when he could advance. He hesitates when he could act. He lowers his aim without recognizing that it has been lowered. All of this occurs without force, without awareness, without resistance. This is the power of silent acceptance. It does not require agreement. It requires only repetition. Consider how easily a man adopts the expectations of those around him. If he is surrounded by limitation, he begins to accept limitation. If he hears repeatedly that success is difficult, he is surrounded by limitation, he begins to accept limitation. If he hears repeatedly that success is difficult, he begins to approach it with caution. If he observes hesitation, he begins to hesitate. He does not decide these things consciously, he absorbs them, and once absorbed, they become part of his thinking. From thinking, they pass into action. From action, they produce result. Thus, the origin of many results lies not in deliberate choice, but in unconscious acceptance. If I were beginning again, I would reverse this process. I would refuse to accept thought without examination. I would not permit repetition alone to determine belief. I would become aware. Awareness is the first step toward control. Without it, a man lives under the influence of forces he does not see. He reacts rather than directs. He follows patterns rather than creating them. He lives within boundaries that were not consciously chosen. But once awareness is gained, something changes. The man begins to notice. He observes that certain thoughts return frequently. He recognizes that some of them do not serve him. He begins this. He observes that certain thoughts return frequently. He recognizes that some of them do not serve him. He begins to question, and in questioning, he interrupts the process. The thought no longer passes without resistance. It is examined, and through examination, its influence is weakened. This is the beginning of authority, not over the world, but over the mind. Of authority, not over the world, but over the mind. If I were to state this plainly, I would say, the greatest danger is not that a man will think incorrectly. It is that he will accept thoughts without knowing that he has done so. For once a thought is accepted, it operates. It influences action, it shapes expectation, it directs behavior, and it does so quietly without announcing its presence. There is no signal that a belief has been formed. There is only the result that follows. If I were beginning again, I would treat every repeated thought with attention, not fear, not resistance, but awareness. I would ask, where did this originate? Why does it return? Does it serve my direction, or does it lead me away from it? In asking these questions, I would begin to separate what is mine from what has been given, and in that separation, I would regain control. Others would begin to notice this change. They would observe that the man does not react as before. He does not accept every suggestion. He does not follow every common belief. He ponders, he chooses. This choice is the mark of independence. Not independence of action alone, but independence of thought. And this form of independence is rare. For most men are guided by what they have heard often, not by what they have chosen deliberately. The man who begins to choose his thoughts becomes different. He becomes directed. He becomes intentional. He becomes less influenced by the opinions of others and more guided by his own examination. This produces a form of quiet strength, not visible in outward display, but evident in consistency. For when a man governs his thoughts, his actions follow. And when his actions are consistent, his results become predictable. If I were to express this as instruction, I would say, do not accept every thought that enters your mind. Examine it, question it, choose it. Let this be fixed firmly within. I do not accept thought without awareness. I examine what I receive. I choose what I repeat. Repeat this not for comfort, but for direction. For the mind, when guided repeatedly, begins to follow instruction. And when instruction replaces unconscious acceptance, control is established. Thus, if I were to begin again from nothing, I would begin here. Not with changing action, not with seeking opportunity, but with seeing clearly. For what is seen may be changed, and what is unseen will continue to operate. And in seeing, the man takes the first step, not merely toward success, but toward control of the very force that determines it. Having understood that repetition shapes belief, the next realization, if I were to begin again, is that repetition does not arise by chance. It is supplied in great measure by one's environment. What surrounds a man determines what is presented to his mind. And what is presented repeatedly becomes what he accepts. Environment is not merely a place. It is a constant influence. It is the sum of what a man hears, observes, and encounters each day. What you have just listened to was only the first half of this lecture. Access the full lecture through the first link in the description. By the way, hey, I'm Eon, the founder of this channel. I started this channel and wanted to stay in the background and keep the main focus on the message of this channel. But as our community continued to grow, I decided to step forward, take responsibility, and build something stronger around these ideas. So hey, nice to meet you. I'm Eon, and don't forget to access the full lecture through the first link in the description.